Hello, guys. Uh, I just wanted to let you guys know that uh, I will be, or you guys will be experiencing slower posts. That's because I started school again. My break is over, so I got to get back on that grind for school. But that doesn't mean I'm gonna stop. So I will post there, and then I will post weekends for sure. That well, not always guaranteed, but anyways. uh, Book Lambda. So here we go. So we start off with a author's note, a translator's note. So Lambda 1. Book Lambda constitutes a complete and independent course in general philosophy, which gives a central emphasis to theology. Its relation to the bulk of the metaphysics is a subject of intense debate. It certainly offers perspectives on the doctrine of substance which are not founded elsewhere in the work. Lambda divides into two halves. The first six chapters, which are a comprehensive course in natural philosophy, and the last four chapters, which present Aristotle's mature theology. Chapter 1 launches the general course in natural philosophy. It broaches the topic of substance and echoes Zeta 1. In stressing that philosophy investigates the principles and causes of substances, it stresses the priority of substance and sketches the dispute between naturalists and idealists about the nature of substance. Aristotle himself proposes three fundamental kinds of substance: substance which is perceptible and perishable, substance which is perceptible and imperishable, and substance which is immune to which is immune to change of any kind. The first two of these fall in the domain of natural science, the latter in that of logic and mathematics. If there is some common source of all substance, then it is the business of theology to investigate this. The rest of this chapter, the rest of this first chapter is devoted to a presentation of the general doctrine of change found in Physics 1. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. 1. Our whole investigation is into substance, for what we are really seeking is the principles and causes of substances. Because if 1. The universe is physically a kind of whole, then substance is its primary constituent. And if 2. It conforms to the ontology of the categories, then on this approach also substance will be primary, then quality, then quantity. B. At the same time, such things as qualities and movements are not even beings in the simple way of speaking. If we did count them as beings, we would also have to admit the not white and the not straight, for, to be sure, we assert being of these things too. Cf. Is not white. C. Again, none of the other categories is separable. D. The pre-Socratics in effect bear this out, for their inquiry was really into the principles, elements, and causes of substance. There is a contemporary tendency to posit universals as substances, for the kinds are universals, which modern thinkers are inclined to assert to be principles and substances, given their dialectical approach, whereas in antiquity particular things, such as fire and earth, were taken as substances, not the general thing, body. 2. Now there are three substances of which one sort is sensible, of which the one is eternal, and 2. The other destructible. This substance, that of plants and animals, is universally acknowledged, and we must grasp its elements and decide whether they are one or many. And B. The other is unmoved. This substance is sometimes asserted to be separable. Some philosophers divide it into two, while others assign both forms and mathematicals to the same nature, and still others only admit mathematicals from this group. Now 2a, 1, and 2 belong to the study of nature, for they are associated with movement, while B belongs to another study, assuming that they have no principle in common. At any rate, sensible substance is susceptible of change. Now 1. Change is from opposites or the intermediate, and 2. not from all opposites, for there cannot be change from the color white to a voice, say, although white is indeed an opposite of voice, but from contraries. So, 3. There must necessarily be some underlying thing changing into the contrary state, since the contraries themselves do not change. We have another translator's note, Lambda 2. This chapter continues the exposition of the doctrine of change found in the physics. The doctrine stresses that there must be something which persists through change, and this chapter associates this persistent with matter. It proceeds to enumerate the 4 kinds of change and connects the doctrine of change with that of potentiality and actuality. Matter is presented as the source of diversity and variety in the world. The general conclusion is that there are 3 causes and fundamental principles of perceptible substance: form, privation, and matter. The teaching of the first 2 chapters of Lambda is close to that of the physics, though it is distinctive both for its compression and for the greater role that it assigns to the notions of potentiality and actuality. It forms the basis for the further observations on natural philosophy which make up the rest of the first half of Lambda. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. 5. There is then in change a continuant, while the first of the 2 contrary states involved does not persist. There is then a third thing in addition to the contraries, namely matter. 6. There are, of course, 4 kinds of change, corresponding to the 4 kinds of question. What is X? What is X like? How great is X? And where is X? Now, 1. The first kind, change involving a this, is generation or destruction simplicator. 2. Quantitative change is increase and diminution. 3. Qualitative change is alteration. And 4. Locational change is travel. A change, then, is made what it is by the pair of contraries that it involves. 7. Now it is surely necessary that the changing matter should potentially be both contraries. What is being twofold, all change, is from what is potentially to what is actually, from potentially white, say, to actually white. Similarly, with increase and diminution and the others, this is the reason why not only is there coming to be from what is not accidentally, but every case of coming to be is also from what is. It is from what is potentially, but not actually. 8. This is in effect a refinement of Anaxagoras' doctrine of the one. It is surely an improvement on his all things were together, as also the mixing of Empedocles and Anaximander, and indeed the position of Democritus to adopt the view that all things originally were in potentiality but not in actuality. In any case, it would seem on this construal that these thinkers were feeling their way towards the notion of matter. 9. However, although everything that changes has matter, the kinds differ. For those of the eternal things that are not generated but do change by locomotion also have matter, but their matter is ungenerated, though it is susceptible of change as travel. 10. There is perhaps this further problem. What sort of what is not is the starting point for generation? This arises because what is not is threefold. 11. A thing, then, may potentially be, but what it potentially is not contingent. Rather, different actualities realize different potentialities. Nor is it a sufficient explanation of the world to say just that all things were originally together, for things differ in matter. Indeed, why otherwise did an infinity of things come to be and not just one? Mind, after all, is single, so that if matter too were single, the only thing that would have actually come to be would be what matter was, potentially a single thing. 12. To sum up, there are 3 causes and 3 principles. 2 of the principles are contraries, of which one is the form and account, and the other the privation, and the third is matter. We have another translator's note, Lambda 3. The subject of chapter 3 shifts away from change towards substance. There are a variety of points in the chapter, which coheres rather loosely. Aristotle begins by stating that, whereas it is only primary matter and primary form that are in fact exempt from generation. In explanation, the components of a composite entity should be treated as primary in definition. This is followed by some remarks on accidental and spontaneous generation, in sympathy with the account given in Zeta 7. The problem with accidental generation is that the formal cause does not seem to be appropriately operative. Aristotle's solution is to characterize such generation as generation by formal privation. The next question addressed is that of the existence of immaterial form. Aristotle softens his normal hostility to the extent of admitting that whereas immaterial form is not possible for artifacts, it may be possible for natural entities. Finally, the traditional argument from causation for the existence of the forms is refuted by the insistence that the formal cause is not temporally prior to the composite. The efficient cause is thus prior, but this gives no reason to infer the existence of separable forms. And in any case, both efficient and formal cause are non-separable. The efficient cause of a man is a man, and the formal cause is his soul, not man himself. That's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. Supplementary note 1. In the claim that neither matter nor form are generated, it is ultimate matter and form that is intended. Our motto of change is that in all cases there is a thing that undergoes change, b, something by which it is changed, and c, something into which it changes. We further claim that the role of b is played by the primary mover, that of a by the thing's matter, and that of c by its form. On this model, however, there would be an infinite regress of explanation if it is not merely the case that bronze becomes spherical, but also that sphericality and bronze also come into being. In practice, there must be some stopping point. Supplementary note 2. Each substance is generated from a synonym, whether it is a natural existent or something else. There are 4 modes of substantial generation: artificial, natural, fortuitous, and spontaneous. Artifice, then, is a principle in something different from nature. Artifice, then, is a principle in something different from nature, a principle in something the same as the thing generated. For example, man produces man, and the other modes are privations of these. Supplementary note 3. There are 3 kinds of substance. There is a matter, which is a this such to the senses, for everything that is apprehended just by touch and not as a whole organism is underlying material. And there is also b, a thing's nature, which is both a this such and a certain condition into which it develops. Finally, the 3rd kind of substance is c, the composite particular, such as Socrates or Callias. Now, in some cases, there is no this such apart from the composite substance. The form of a house is an example. It can only have separate existence if the art of architecture is itself a separate existent. Nor is there any generation and destruction of these artificial forms. The existence or non-existence of an immaterial house is of quite a different kind, and also that of health and of every other product of art. So if there is in fact any separate existence of non-composites, then it occurs in the case of natural things. So Plato was not wrong to make his forms coextensive with natural existence, if indeed there are forms, but that does not mean that he should have allowed such forms as fire, flesh, and head, for these are all material, and it is the last that is the material of what is most clearly a substance. Supplementary note 4. Motive causes are causes as pre-existent entities, while formal causes are simultaneous. For when a man is healthy, it is then too that health exists, and the shape of the bronze sphere exists simultaneously with the bronze sphere. It is, however, an open question whether any component survives the dissolution of the composite. After all, in some cases, nothing prevents this from being so. As for instance, if the soul is such a component, not all of it, just the intellect, it is perhaps impossible that it should all be. A positive answer, however, would provide absolutely no grounds to suppose that there must be forms. It is a man that generates a man. a particular that generates a thing of its kind, and particular generation also occurs with artifacts. The form of health just is the doctor's competence. We have another translator's note, Lambda 4. Chapter 4 is again a rather loose structure, but it is unified by its anti-idealist thrust. Aristotle begins by arguing against the supposition that there can be some more fundamental constituent he has in mind, numbers, defended in this world by the Pythagoreans and their allies, notably Speusippus, if that's how you pronounce his name, which underlies the categories of being. To accept any such constituent is to erode the crucial distinction between substance and the non-substantial categories. Aristotle is equally trenchant in rejecting universal causal agents, with the exception of form, privation, and matter, which we have seen to be universal causes. All other causal agents are restricted to their appropriate genera. Causal generalization across genera is unfruitful. The chapter also adds the efficient cause as a principle in addition to the elements of the composite, form, privation, and matter, and the discussion of the kinds of cause is completed by the identification of the ultimate final cause with the prime mover, to be described in detail in the theological chapters of Lambda. That is the end of the author's note. Back to the metaphysics. A. Now, there is a way in which the causes and the principles of different things are themselves different, but there is another if one is speaking at the level of universals, where analogy arises in which the causes and the principles are the same for all things. There is now a possible controversy over the following point. Are the principles and the elements of substances the same as or different from those of relational entities? And similarly, indeed, with each of the categories. 1. In fact, it would be absurd if they were the same for all, for in that case relational entities and substances would be produced from the same things. What then will they be? Apart from substance and the other categories, there is no common entity. And yet an element must be prior to the things of which it is an element. Very obviously, substance cannot be an element of relational entities, nor any of these an element of substance. 2. Furthermore, how is it even possible for there to be the same elements for all things? No element can be identical to a compound of elements. For instance, neither B nor A can be identical to BA. It is a rider to this that none of the intelligible entities such as existence or unity can be an element, for these also apply to all composites. No element, then, will be either a substance or a relational entity, and yet this would have to be the case. If substances and relational entities were to share principles and elements, so it follows that there are not the same elements for all things. B. Or perhaps, as we said, in a way there are, and in a way there are not. For instance, perhaps heat is a formal element of sensible bodies, and also in another way its privation, cold, while the material element is whatever has a primary and intrinsic potentiality to be these. These elements themselves will be substances, and so will be their compounds, of which they will also be the principles. That is, whatever becomes one thing from heat and cold, such as flesh and bone, given the necessary substantial difference between element and compound. Such entities then will indeed share elements and principles, and other things will share others. But in this way of speaking, there will be no universal elements. They will be said to be only by analogy, as in the claim that there are just three principles, form, privation, and material, but each such principle will be different in connection with a different genus. For instance, in the case of the colors, they will be white, black, and the surface respectively, and another threesome would be light, darkness, and air, from which are derived day and night. See, not only intrinsic elements are causes, however, but also some external factors, conspicuously the motive cause. This makes it clear that principle and element are different things, and that both are causes, and that principles divide into elements and non-elements. and that the source of motion or rest is a kind of principle. Thus, at the level of analogy, the number of elements is indeed 3, but that of the causes and principles is 4. But both elements and the primary motive cause differ in different cases. Consider the threesome health disease body. In this case, the motive cause is medicine. Consider form F, disorder as seen, bricks. Here, the motive cause is architecture. Such are the subdivisions of the motive principle. D. Now, in the case of natural objects, the motive cause is something of the same species, such as a man causing a man. In the case of the products of calculation, however, the motive cause is the form or the opposite. There is thus a way in which there are 3 causes, but in the way which we are considering there are 4, for in a way health is indeed the same thing as medicine, and architecture as the form of a house. And man does indeed breed man, but then, in addition to these, there is that which moves all as the first thing of all. We have another translator's note, Lambda 5. This chapter is a close continuation of chapter 4 and begins with a reassertion of the fundamental importance of substance, which was one of the main themes of the earlier chapter. To the universal principles allowed in chapter 4, actuality and potentiality are now added with certain restrictions, but it is insisted that the use of actuality and potentiality in explanation must be in compliance with the characteristics of each genus and species. The chapter also points out that explanation in terms of actuality and potentiality is not really supplementary to explanation in terms of the earlier principles. Since the actual is to be identified with form, the composite and privation, and the potential is to be identified with matter. The second main business of chapter 5 and of chapter 4 is to stress that material potentiality on its own is insufficient to explain the production of the composite. An external efficient cause with actual being is required to initiate the process of production. Although this is indeed conditioned by the material cause, together with the previous chapter, this chapter offers a clear statement of Aristotle's substance-based metaphysics, in distinction to the idealism of the Pythagoreans and the Academy and the materialism of those who reject the diversity of causation. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. A. Given that there are some things that are separate and some that are not separate, it is the latter that are substances. Hence there are the same the same causes for them all. Inasmuch as without substances there are no qualities and movements. Now further, these causes will in a given case be, say, soul and body, or alternatively intellect and appetite and body. B. There is, however, also another way in which, at the level of analogy, principles are the same, and this is that of activation and potential. These two, though both differ for different things and also apply in different ways. There are certainly things that exist at one time actually and at another time potentially. Wine is an example, or flesh, or a man. For such things there is also a good fit between their activation and potential and the causes that have been outlined. Activation is the form's mode of existence assuming its separation, and also the composites. The privation is comparable to darkness or something diseased, and the potential is matter's mode of existence, given that it is the matter that has the potential to become both the others. In another way, however, there are things for which the activated and potential existence is different. I have in mind things that do not share the same matter, and of which there is not the same form, but a different one. This is the way, for instance, in which his elements are a cause of man. Now his elements are, materially, fire and earth, and formally, his peculiar form. There is, however, also a further external factor. On the one hand, in the role of the Father, but also, in addition, in that of the Son and its oblique rotation. These external factors are not material, nor are they a form, nor a privation, nor a member of the same species. What are they? They are motive causes. C. Let me show you on the board just how one column of causes and principles can be said universally and the other cannot. On the one hand, then, the first principles of all things are A, whatever has, in activation, the primary quote-unquote thisness, and B, whatever is potentially F for the appropriate F. Now, these causes and principles which we have been discussing are logical, not real entities. For a principle of particular things must itself be a particular thing. It is true that man is a principle of man at the universal level, but there is no universal man in reality. Rather, it is Peleus that is the motive cause of Achilles and your father that is yours. A particular B is the motive cause of a particular BA, even though at the unqualified level it is indeed the universal B that is the cause of the universal BA. Furthermore, the causes and elements of substances, albeit different causes of different ones, are also, as has been said, the causes and elements of things not in different categories, of colors, sounds, substances, quality alike, but they are only so by analogy. But also even things in the same species have different causes, differing not, evidently, by species, but inasmuch as particular things have different causes. For instance, your matter, form, and motive cause are all different from mine, but for all that, at the universal level of description, they are the same. To the questions, then, what are the principles and elements of substances, relational entities, and qualities, and whether they are the same or different, the answer is clear. When many different ways of speaking are run together, the principles are indeed the same. But when the ways are distinguished, they are not the same but different, except, of course, in the way at which I am now pointing. In this way, at the level of analogy, they are the same for all things, in that they are matter, form, privation, and motive cause. And it is in this way that the causes of the substances are the causes of all things, in that when substances are removed, so is everything else, and the primary inactivation also belongs in this column. In the other column, on the other hand, the primary causes are not the same for all. These are all opposites that do not define genera and are not spoken of in a multiplicity of ways, and similarly with the varieties of matter. Okay, we have now set out what are the principles of sensibles and how many of them there are, and in what way they are the same and in what way they are different. So we have another translator's note. Lambda 6. Chapter 6 has a pivotal role within the structure of Lambda, being both the conclusion to the general philosophy of nature, which is the content of the first half of the book, and the first stage of the theological exposition which occupies the last 4 chapters. The chapter contains a proof of the necessary existence of an eternal substance which is immune to change. The argument runs as follows. There must be some eternal and unchanged substance, because otherwise all substance would be perishable, and that would mean that everything in the world was perishable. However, the world itself and time are clearly not perishable, but they could only be imperishable if there is something immanent which is itself imperishable. Therefore, there must be an eternal and imperishable substance. This argument has already been used by Aristotle in Physics 8. And it is usually objected that it commits the fallacy of distribution, because the whole world is imperishable. If it is, it does not follow that anything in it is imperishable. However, Aristotle makes an addition to the argument in the present chapter, which is perhaps intended to meet the force of this objection. He identifies the eternal substance with pure actuality. The eternal substance can never have merely potential being, since, in that case, the continuity of its existence would not be guaranteed. But if there is an eternal substance, which is never potential and always actual, then the eternity of the world is guaranteed in a way that would not be the case if there were no such substance. It is possible for the world to be eternal, without anything in it being eternal, but it is not possible for it to be necessarily eternal. Aristotle is arguing, unless there is something in it which is necessarily eternal, such a thing would have to be a substance having being in pure actuality. Such a substance would also explain the production of the world, in contrast to a Platonic form, which would be inert as an efficient cause. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. 1. Now, since there were three substances, two of them natural and the third unmoved, we would say about this last that there must be a kind of eternal unmoved substance. 2. To begin with, substances have priority among things that are. So, if they are all destructible, then all things are destructible. It is, however, impossible that movement should either come to be or be destroyed. It must always have been in existence, and the same can be said for time itself, since it is not even possible for there to be an earlier and a later if time does not exist. Movement, then, is also continuous in the way in which time is. Indeed, time is either identical to movement or is some affection of it. There is, however, only one continuous movement, namely spatial movement, and of this only circular rotation. 3. Suppose now that there is indeed something that is such as to move and affect other things, but that it is not active. In such circumstances, there may still be no movement, since it is quite possible for something that has a capacity not to be active. In that case, there would be no advantage at all from the admission of eternal substances, as in the theory of forms, unless there is among them a principle capable of moving something else. Not even this, however, is insufficient, nor any other substance in addition to the forms. Unless the further factor is active, there will still be no movement. 4. Nor will it be enough even for it to be active. If its substance is potentiality, then there will be movement, but not eternal movement, since for anything that is potentially, its not being might obtain. 5. There must then be a principle of such a kind that its substance is activity. Ergo, these substances must be without matter, for their eternity is a condition on that of anything else. They then must be actuality. 6. And yet there is a problem, for it is generally accepted that while everything that is active is also potential, not everything that is potential is active. Potentiality, accordingly, will be the prior thing, and yet if so, there might perhaps have been none of the things that are, for it is possible for them to be capable of being, but not yet to be. 7. Alternatively, suppose we were to accept the mythical genesis of the world from Knight or the natural philosopher's claim that all things were originally together. We are still left with the same impossible consequence. How is everything to be set in motion unless there is actually to be some cause of movement? Matter is not going to set itself in motion. Its movement depends on a motive cause, such as carpentry. Similarly, menstrual fluids need to be set in motion by sperm, and the earth by seed. 8. Such considerations have led some, like Leucippus and Plato, to posit eternal actuality, on the assumption that there must always have been movement, but they neither explain their reasoning nor specify the kind of actuality, nor indeed give the reason for the resultant movement being any one way rather than another. Nothing, in fact, will be moved by chance, but some causal factor must always be present. In our world, something will undergo natural movement in one way and enforced movement, either by mind or by something else in another. We are also owed an answer to the question which kind of movement is primary, for this makes a great deal of difference. 9. Plato, indeed, for his part, cannot even name what he from time to time supposes to be the principles, the self-mover. After all, on his story, the soul is later to, and, or at the same time as, the heavens. On the one hand, then, to suppose that potentiality is prior to actuality is to speak correctly, and in another way it is not, and we have explained which these ways are. The priority of actuality is also attested by Anaxagoras. His mind is actuality by the Empedoclean doctrine of love and strife, and by those who, with Leucippus, insist that there is always movement. 11. Accordingly, there was no eternity of chaos and night, but there have always been the same things, either in periodic exchange or in some other way. Given that actuality is prior to potentiality, if they have always been the same in periodic cycles, there must still always have been something that is permanently actual. 12. But if there is to be generation and destruction, there must always be a different thing active in one way or another. For it is necessary that this must in one way act per se, and in another way in virtue of something else, either something further or what is primary. In fact, it must be the latter, for otherwise this will be cause for the former and for the original thing. But the primary must surely be superior, and better, clearly, than that which is always in a different way. Surely it is thus then with movements. Why then should we seek for other principles? We have another translator's note, Lambda 7. In this famous chapter, Aristotle gives his statement of the nature of the deity as part of his system. His theology builds directly on the physical conclusions presented in chapter 6. We begin with the claim that the eternal and actual substance must also be the prime mover, the source of all process and change in the universe. But although it is the ultimate source of all process, it cannot itself be subject to process of any kind. Aristotle must therefore explain how it is possible for the initiator of a physical process, let alone all physical processes, to be immune from process itself. His solution is that the prime mover must cause process by being an object of desire, what modern philosophers call an intentional object. He digresses to establish that the movement of the heavens could not be spontaneous, since in that case it might change, and then proceeds to show how the prime mover acts as an intentional object for the heavens. It would only be possible for the prime mover to be the supreme object of desire in this way if its existence was supremely desirable or enviable. The prime mover must therefore enjoy the best possible life, and this is a characteristic traditionally ascribed to the divine. Thus the prime mover is to be equated with God, but an explanation is still required of what the highest form of life is. Aristotle draws on his ethical theory to argue that the highest form of life is contemplative thought. The prime mover must enjoy this life of necessity, and this can only be secured if his contemplation is of a special, reflexive kind. He must be permanently engaged in contemplation of contemplation, thought about thought. It is much disputed what precisely this can mean, but it is perhaps the case that Aristotle wishes to suggest that the prime mover is conscious of his contemplation in a way that exceeds the capacity of ordinary, including human thinkers. The rest of the chapter is devoted to attacks on rival theories of the divine and to show that his account is in line with popular opinions. Alright, so that's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. A. The account that we have offered is a coherent one. If it is incorrect, then there is no alternative to the world's generation being from night and from everything being together and from that which is not. I take it that this confirms our solution. There is something which is always moved through an uninterrupted motion, and this motion is circular, as is evident not merely by argument but as a matter of fact, and consequently the primary heaven will be eternal. But there will then also be something that moves them, and since that which is moved and which also moves is an intermediate, it follows that there must be something that moves without being moved. This will be eternal, it will be a substance, and it will be activation. B. Now it is in just this way that the object of desire and the object of thought produce movement. They move without being moved, and indeed the primary objects of both are the same. The object of appetite is what seems good, and the primary object of wish is what really is good. This is because it is rather the case that we desire something because we believe it to be good than what we believe a thing to be good because we desire it. It is the thought that starts things off. C. Now the source of movement for the thought is the object of thought, and of the two systoikiae, one is intrinsically the object of thought. On this side, then, substance is primary, and within substance, that which is simple and is in activation. By the way, Single and simple are not the same. The former indicates a certain measure, while simplicity indicates a thing's state. But look, the good and the intrinsically desirable are on the same side of the list, and obviously whatever is primary is also the best of any group or analogous to it. Furthermore, the end of anything must always be among those things that are not moved. To show this, we must draw a distinction. An end is either a beneficiary or an objective, but it is only one of these that is unmoved. Now the end in the latter sense produces movement by dint of being the object of desire, and it does so primarily in the heavens and through them in everything else. D. Now whatever is itself moved admits of being in a different state. Hence the primary circuit of the heavens, even if it exists in activation, could be in a different state from that in which it is in fact moved. But there is in fact something that moves without being itself moved, existing in activation, and this does not admit of being in any way and in another state. For spatial movement is the first of the changes, and of spatial movements rotation is the first. And it is this movement that the first mover produces, its existence, then is necessary, and in that it is necessary it is good. And it is in this way that it is a principle, for there is necessity as in the following ways. 1. What is enforced, in that it is contrary to its tendency. 2. That on which well-being is conditional. And 3. Whatever does not admit of being in any other way than absolutely. E. On such a principle, then, does the heaven and the natural world depend, and its continuous life is like ours at its very best for short moments. Such is its eternal state, which for us would be impossible, since its activation is also its pleasure. At any rate, this explains why waking, perception, and thought give us so much pleasure, and why they in turn sweeten hopes and recollections. F1. The intrinsic object of thought is what is intrinsically best, and the intrinsic object of absolute thought is the absolutely best. And in apprehending its object, thought thinks itself, for it too becomes an object for itself by its contact with, and thinking of, its object, so that the thought and its object are one and the same. 2. For thought is whatever is receptive of the object of thought, the intelligible substance, and it is activated by the possession of its object. It is accordingly the object rather than the thought. That is the divine element that thinking is believed to possess. Hence, too, the supreme pleasure and excellence of contemplation. If then God's well-being is forever, what ours is at moments, then it is a fit object of wonder, and all the more so if it is even greater. And this last is in fact the truth. 3. And God also has life, for the activation of thought is a life, and He is that activation. His intrinsic activation is supreme eternal life. Accordingly, we assert that God is a supreme and eternal living being, so that to God belong life and continuous and eternal duration. For what is what God is? G. As for those who suppose, with the Pythagoreans and Speusippus, that the highest excellence and goodness are not at the beginning, on the grounds that both for plants and for animals their causes are indeed their first principles, but excellence and perfection arise in what comes from them, they err, for source of the seed is other, formerly complete specimens, and the primary being is not and the primary thing is not the seed, but the complete specimen. Of course, one would say that a man is prior to his seed, meaning not the man to come from that seed, but the other man, from whom comes the seed. H. Our discussion has, in fancy, established that there exists a kind of eternal, unmoved substance that is separate from sensible things. It has further been shown that it is impossible for it to have any magnitude, but that it is without parts and indivisible. The reason is that it is a source of movement for infinite time, and nothing that is finite has an infinite capacity. Hence, given that every magnitude is either finite or infinite, it could not have a finite magnitude, but neither could it have an infinite one, since there is quite generally no such thing as an infinite magnitude. It has also been shown that it is without affection or alteration, since all the other motions are posterior to those in space. It should be quite clear then why the first mover is as we have said. And we have another translator's note, Lambda 8. It might be said that in moving from chapter 7 to chapter 8 of Lambda, we pass from the sublime to the ridiculous, whereas the whole thrust of chapter 7 had been to show that there could only be a single prime mover who is to be equated with God. Chapter 8 raises the question whether there is a plurality of such movers, and indeed how many there are. It provides the extraordinary answer that there are either 47 or 55 such movers. The chapter begins by insisting that the issue about the number of prime movers can only be posed if substances rather than numbers are taken to be fundamental. It then gives an argument for a plurality of prime movers based on an astronomical argument about the number of eternal movements in the heavens. This argument is complex and its conclusion is obscure. Aristotle seems to hesitate between 47 and 55 as the number of prime movers, and the arguments in favor of 47 seem better to justify 49. The astronomical arguments are followed by logical arguments to show that there must be the same number of prime movers as there are eternal movements. This argument itself, however, is immediately followed by a logical argument to show that there can only be a single prime mover. The chapter ends with a reconciliation of the doctrine of multiple prime movers with traditional religious belief. The chapter is on any account vexed, although attempts have been made to show its compatibility with the rest of Lambda. The consensus of opinion is that it is a somewhat confused interpolation. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. A. We must now consider two questions. Should we admit one such substance or several? And, if several, how many? We should also give notice that the assertions of our rivals in answer to the latter question do not even admit of clear statement. The theory of forms has no proprietary answer here. The theory holds that the forms are numbers, but as for numbers themselves, some versions take them to be unlimited, and some to be circumscribed by the decad, which is 10, by the way. But as to a reason why the multiplicity of numbers should be just so great, nothing sufficiently serious is offered to be considered a demonstration. So let us address the question on the basis of our own suppositions and distinctions. B. Our principle, the primary being, is unmovable, both intrinsically and accidentally, and yet is the source of the primary movement, which is eternal and single, however. 1. Necessarily what is moved by something else. 1. Necessarily what is moved by something. 2. Necessarily the prime mover must be intrinsically unmoved. 3. Necessarily A. Eternal movement must be produced by something eternal. And B. Single movement must be produced by something single. 4. We observe in addition to the simple course of the whole universe, which we are asserting to be produced by the primary, unmoved substance, other eternal courses, to wit those of the planets. 5. The physics has demonstrated that the rotatory body is eternal and unresting. 6. It follows of necessity that each of the planetary courses is also the object of an intrinsically unmoved and eternal substance. Further, 7. The nature of the stars is a kind of substance and therefore eternal. 8. The source of movement is eternal and prior to what gets moved. 9. Necessarily, whatever is prior to a substance is a substance. So 10. It is clearly necessary that the number of substances eternal in their nature and intrinsically unmovable and without magnitude for the reason given above should equal that of the movements of the stars. The upshot of this is that the movers are substances, and it is also clear that the order of priority among them corresponds to the order of the stellar courses. But how many such courses are there? To answer this, we must turn to that one of the mathematical sciences that has the profoundest affinity to philosophy, namely astronomy. The preoccupation of astronomy is with substance that is, on the one hand, sensible, on the other, eternal. While the other branches of mathematics, such as arithmetic and geometry, are concerned with no kind of substance. Now, even the most cursory consideration will reveal that the number of courses exceeds that of the bodies. After all, each of the wandering stars travels in more than a single course. But what is this number in fact? Let us begin. To get a feel for the issue, with the proposals of a few mathematicians, this will give us at least a definite number to play with. Thereafter, we must combine our own researches with a scrutiny of the results of others. Should it be that any of the specialists have suggestions at variance with what we have so far supposed, then we should befriend both sides, but run with those who hit the spot. The system of Eudoxus, the courses of the sun and the moon each occur in three spheres. The first is that of the fixed stars, the second rotates through the middle of the zodiac, and the third at an inclination to the width of the zodiac. The difference is that the angle of inclination of this third sphere is greater for the moon than for the sun. The courses of the planets each occur in four spheres. The first two are the same as with the sun and moon. The sphere of the fixed stars is the one that carries all the others, and the second sphere, immediately beneath it and rotating through the middle of the zodiac, is also common to all bodies. For all the planets, the poles of the third sphere lie in the circle that bisects the zodiac, and the course of the fourth sphere is in the circle that is inclined at an angle to the equator of the third sphere. And the poles of the third sphere are particular for all the planets, except for those of Venus and Mercury, which coincide. The system of Callippus, the position of the spheres is as with Eudoxus. As for their number, it is the same for the spheres of Jupiter and Saturn. To those of the sun and moon, however, 2 extra spheres have to be added to comply with observation, and 1 to each of the other planets. However, this is still not enough to comply with observation. In fact, each of the planets must have other spheres, one less than the Callippan ones in each case, which counteract the Eudoxian Callippan ones. These will return to its position, the first sphere of the star in each case immediately below. This is the only way in which the universe as a whole can produce the courses of the planets. Thus, 1. Spheres of the planetary courses, 8 plus 25 equals 33. 2. Given that only those by which the lowest situated planet is moved needed not be counteracted, spheres counteracting the first 2 planets. 6. 3. Spheres counteracting the next 4 planets. 16. 4. Total number of spheres carrying and counteracting. 55. If one does not assign the additional movements that have been mentioned to the sun and moon, then the total will come to 47. Okay. This is our estimate of the number of spheres. The point is that it is possible to assume that the number of substances and unmovable principles is the same. We leave to more rigorous thinkers than ourselves the proof of all this. See, on the other hand, 1. If there can be no course that does not contribute to the course of a star, and 2. Every nature and every substance that is unaffected and has intrinsically achieved the best state must be held to be a purpose. 3. Then there could not be any other nature besides these, and the number of substances must be what we have given. For consider, 4. If there were others, then they would, as purposes, produce courses. But 5. It is impossible that there be other courses beyond those mentioned. It is plausible to suppose that this from the bodies in circuit as follows. 6. If every carrier exists for the sake of what is carried, and every course is for the sake of something carried. 7. Then no course would exist either for its own sake, or for that of any other course, but rather for the sake of the stars. For 8. Suppose there were a course for some course's sake, then 9. The latter would in turn have to exist for the sake of happening else, so that to avoid an infinite regress. 10. The purpose of every course will be some one of the divine bodies traveling through the heaven. D. That the heaven itself is single is, at least, clear for E1. If there were many heavens, as there are many men, then 2. The principles for each heaven will be one in form but many in number. 3. But everything that is numerically plural has matter, one and the same form, such as that of man, applies to many things, yet an individual such as Socrates is numerically single. 4. but the primary essence does not have matter, since it is an entelechy. So 5. The unmovable first mover must be both formally and numerically single. So 6. The permanent and continuous object of movement must also be single. So 7. There is one single heaven only. F. We should also consider another tradition from old and indeed extremely ancient times. There has been handed down to our later age intimations of a mythical character to the effect that the stars are gods and that the divine embraces the whole of nature. The further details were subsequently added in the manner of myth. Their purpose was the persuasion of the masses and general legislative and political expediency. For instance, the myths tell us that these gods are anthropomorphic or resemble some of the other animals and give us other comparable extrapolations of the basic picture. If then we discard these accretions and consider the central feature that they held the primary substances to be gods, we might well believe the claim to have been directly inspired. We might also conclude that while it is highly probable that all possible arts and doctrines have been many times discovered and lost, these ancient cosmologies have been preserved like holy relics. Right up to the present day, it is these and these alone that we can know clearly of the ancestral, indeed primordial beliefs. We have another translator's note, Lambda 9. After the interruption of chapter 8, the argument returns in chapter 9 to a central topic of chapter 7, the notion of thought about thought. Unfortunately, chapter 9 by no means fully clarifies this obscure notion, but it does give arguments to show that the object of thought must be reflexive in this way, and they may throw some light on Aristotle's conception. The requirement that thought be about itself for the prime mover is intended to eliminate various possibilities that would undermine the dignity of his thought. His thought might not have any object at some point, a danger which is avoided by its being permanently actual. But it might also depend on the operation of some other agency, in which case it would be dependent and thus not supremely desirable, or it might be directed at something higher than itself, in which case that latter thing, not the thought of it, would be the supreme object of desire. Alternatively, thought might be about some unworthy object. All these unattractive possibilities are avoided in Aristotle's view. If the object of thought is thought itself, this will guarantee both the continuity of thought and that its object will always be worthy of it without exceeding it in dignity and thus desirability. That's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. There are, however, certain difficulties with our account of divine thought. A. On the one hand, it is readily agreed that thinking is the most godlike of things in our experience, but there are some problems involved in showing exactly what state it must be in to be of this kind. Suppose that it is empty of thought, where then would be its grandeur? It is in that state that it would be in if it were asleep. Alternatively, suppose that it thinks, but that its doing so is under the control of some other factor, so that what is its substance is not now the activation of thought, but merely the potential for it. In that case, its substance would fall short of supreme excellence, since it is thinking that confers its merit on it. B. And again, either potential thought or actual thinking is its substance, but in either case, what does it think? Obviously, it either thinks of itself or some other thing, and either of the same objects always or of different objects. Does it then make any difference or none at all, whether it thinks of the good or of any arbitrary object whatever? C. Also, are there not some objects about which it is absurd that it should ratiocinate or ratiocinate? Well, clearly, its object is the most divine and worthy thing there is, and it is also not subject to change, for any change would be a deterioration, and such a thing is already a kind of movement. And if we suppose that it is not activated thinking, but the potential thereof, then, first, it is plausible that the continuity of its thinking would be rather arduous for it, and secondly, there would clearly then be something else of higher merit than the thinking, to wit the object of thought. Now indeed thinking and thought will belong even to one who thinks the worst thought. How do we get around this? Remember that there are things it is not even better to see than not to see. We deny that it is mere, unqualified thinking that is the best thing. That is just why it must think itself, if it is to retain supremacy, and absolute thinking is the thinking of thinking. But D, it certainly seems that knowledge and perception and opinion and thought are always of something else, and of themselves only incidentally. And E, if to think and to be thought are different, from which of these does thinking derive its excellence? For it is not indeed the same thing to be thinking and to be being thought. Let us look at it this way. In some cases, knowledge just is the object. In the cases of the productive sciences, without matter, the substance and essence is the object, while in the case of the theoretical studies, it is the account and the thinking itself that is the object. It follows that, since the object and subject of thought do not differ for all things that do not have matter, they will be the same in these cases, and the thinking will be one with its object. But there still remains a problem as to whether the object of thought is composite. If so, the thinking would change between parts of the whole. However, everything that does not have matter is indivisible, as the thinking of man, and indeed of any composite entities, is for a certain period of time, for it does not have its excellence at one time or another, but rather its best performance requires a certain whole period, since it is a different thing from the thinking itself. So will the thinking of thinking be for all eternity. We have another translator's note here. Lambda 10. This last chapter provides a conclusion to both the theological and the physical sections of Lambda. Though in reverse order, the first section defends the claims that the universe as a whole is good, and that its goodness derives from the prime mover. Aristotle uses a metaphor to explain the derivation of the goodness of the world from the prime mover. The universe is compared to an army, and just as the excellence of an army stems from its general, so does that of the universe stem from the source of process and change in it. The goodness of the universe is also defended against the objection that it contains chance processes. These no more undermine the goodness of the universe as a whole than the presence of slaves in a household undermines the law-abiding nature of the household as a whole. These metaphorical arguments are strikingly different in character from the arguments used in chapters 7 and 9. The second part of the chapter reasserts and defends some of the doctrine of the natural philosophy presented in the first 6 chapters. The notion of a substrate persisting through change is defended against the explanation of change merely in terms of contraries. And the existence of both perishable and imperishable things is argued to be explicable only on the basis of the doctrine of the diversity of substances. Finally, Aristotle argues that the unity of the composite can only be secured by the identification of the efficient with the final cause. That's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. 1a. Now for another inquiry. In which of the two possible ways does the nature of the universe possess goodness and excellence? Is it as something separated and by itself, or is it by dint of its arrangement? But why should it not be in both ways? This is the case with an army. For instance, in an army, goodness resides both in the organization and in the general. But more in the general. After all, he does not exist because of the organization, but it because of him. B. Now our problem, in a way, to be sure, all things are in a certain arrangement. But many things, such as fish, fowl, and flower, are not arranged in the same way, nor is the condition of the universe such that these two groups are not connected one with another. There is a connection in that all things are indeed arranged around a single purpose. The arrangement of the universe is in fact like that of a household. In a household, it is the free members that have the least liberty to do whatever they please. Most, if not all, of their actions are prescribed. The slaves, on the other hand, and the livestock have little to contribute, and for the most part act as they please. The nature of each of these groups is given by some such principle as this. I mean by the parallel that all objects in the universe share the need to come to a dissolution, and there are other features which, in a similar way, all things share with the universe as a whole. 2a. Let us, however, not overlook the wide range of impossible or absurd consequences of the rival accounts. Let us indeed survey the more sophisticated theories to see which are the least problematic. 1. All theories hold that all things are composed of opposites, but that is wrong in two respects, both in applying to all things and in deriving them from opposites. Above all, they do not explain how those things in which the opposites arise can themselves be composed of opposites. Remember that there can be no mutual affection of opposites. Now, in our theory, this difficulty receives a plausible solution in our postulation of a tertium quid. The other theories assign the role of our matter to one or other of the opposites. For instance, some make the unequal the substrate of the equal, others the many substrate of the one. But the same objection applies to this, that matter, as we conceive it, is not the opposite of anything. 2. Again, on this mere opposites theory, everything except the one will be a participant in evil. Evil itself will be one of its two elements. The alternative is to admit neither evil nor good as principles, but evidently the good is a principle for all things, and is so in the very highest degree. 3. Now the first approach rightly insists that the good is a principle. Its fault is that it does not explain in what way it is a principle, whether as a purpose, as a source of movement, or as a form. 4. This absurdity occurs in the position of Empedocles. His love is what corresponds to the good, but this is a principle both as the source of movement, it produces the contraction, and as matter, it is a part of the mixture. Now it might be an accidental property of something that it is a principle both as matter and as a source of movement, but it cannot be essential to it to be both. In which way, then, we demand, is love a principle? Another absurdity is that he is committed to the indestructibility of strife, for this is his equivalent to the nature of the bad. 5. Anaxagoras, at least, is clear about this. For him, the good is a principle as the source of movement. His mind is a motive factor. However, it produces movement for the sake of something, and this must be something else on any other theory other than ours. We are able to say that the motive medicine is in a certain way the final health. Another absurdity is that he allows no opposite to the good. Mind, in fact, all theories that postulate opposites make no use of them, unless they take on further constraints. 6. Moreover, none of these theories can account for the fact that some things are destructible and others are not, given that they compose all things from the same principles. Also, some have things that are made from what is not, and it is precisely to avoid this that others assert that all things are one. Also, none of these theories explains why there will always be generation, nor what is the cause of generation. 7. Again, if you posit two principles, you must posit also a third, more powerful one. Equally, if you accept the theory of forms, you must allow that there is also another more powerful principle. Only thus can you answer the question why something has come to participate or is participating. Also, the other theories are committed to the existence of an opposite to wisdom and the highest state of knowledge, but ours is not. For there can be no opposite to our primary, since all opposites have matter and also potential existence. The opposite of wisdom is ignorance, and this would be what would yield an opposite object, but in fact there is no opposite to a primary. B. If there are no other entities besides sensibles, then we lose principle, order, and generation, and even the heavenly bodies. We will be left with an infinite regress of principles, as with theological accounts, and, for that matter, all the natural philosophical ones. And if we allow forms or numbers, they will not be the cause of anything, or, if that is too strong, they will, at any rate, not be the cause of any movement. How, too, are magnitude and continuity to come from things without magnitude? Neither as a source of movement nor as a form could number produce continuity, and it certainly will not be possible for one of the opposites to act as what produces and moves. It is perfectly possible for an opposite not to exist. At the very least, its action would be posterior to its potential, but this would not guarantee the eternity of the world. Yet the world is eternal, so one assumption must be abandoned, and yet we have already indicated how this should be done. C. Another complaint is that there is absolutely no explanation from any quarter of the respect in which numbers, or soul and body, or in general form and thing are a unity. And this is not surprising. It cannot be. This is not surprising. and cannot be explained unless, as in our theory, it is the source of movement that produces the unity. Also, those who assert that the mathematical entity number is the primary, and in this way posit a continuing sequence of substances with different principles in each case, render the substance of the universe utterly episodic. For on this view, one substance makes no contribution to any other by existing or by not existing. They also require a multiplicity of principles. The universe, however, has no use for such a bad constitution. Too many kings are bad. Let there be one. That is the end of Book Lambda.